Please join me in welcoming Mr. Mark Doty.
Thank you. That was very nice. That was great. I'm going to have to ask about breakfast tacos in London. We'll see what kind of blank look I get. Well, thank you very much for those great welcomes, and thank you all for being here. I really do feel like I should be wearing a suit, but you know, I get to be the artist on the program here, I guess, today at least. My project today is to talk to you about Walt Whitman, a poet who published himself, his first collection, a little more than 150 years ago. And it seems, on the surface of things, unlikely that a pamphlet, which a journalist from Brooklyn, a man who had worked as a school teacher, as a carpenter, who had run a little bookstore out of his apartment in Brooklyn, a person who had written a bad novel warning readers against the dangers of alcohol abuse, and some not such great journalism, should somehow, seemingly out of nowhere, produce one of the strangest and freshest books ever written, not only in this country, but around the world. A book which continues to feel as alive and peculiar and surprising as the day that he published it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that book, about its coming into being. We'll just take a pause here, let people get settled. And I'm going to sort of read and talk my way through this little lecture about Whitman and his work, and I think we'll have some time for you to ask questions and respond towards the end. So this book was, the first edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was published in 1855, self-published, and Whitman, strangely, did not put his name on the spine of his book, or on the cover, or even on the title page. Imagine going to the trouble of publishing your own work and not signing it, not putting your name on it. Whitman said decades later to a young companion and secretary, Horace Trouble, he said, "It would be a sacrilege to put a name there. It would seem just like putting a name on the universe. It would be ridiculous to think of Leaves of Grass belonging to any one person. At most, I am only the mouthpiece." So, what an interesting thing to suggest that your poems were written by the universe, not by you, but that you are in some way a mouthpiece, that the world is speaking through you. Well, instead of an author's name, when you open the book, what you see is an engraving of the speaker. He was photographed, and an artist did an engraving of that image. And what you see is a person who is not at all like the image of the poet in his times. If you were going to imagine an American poet from the middle of the 19th century, you would probably think of a person with three names, and probably a rather formal aspect. And if there were a picture of that poet, he might be, forgive me, in his suit, and there would probably be a bust of Aristotle or an important figure in the classical tradition behind him, and the poet would look very important. The picture of Walt Whitman shows him in a work shirt, with the collar open so that you can see the undershirt or union suit that he's wearing. He's wearing a slouchy hat that looks a little bit battered, and he's standing like this with one hand on his hip, looking directly at the reader, as if to say, "Hey, who do you think I am? Who do you think you are?" It's a very direct, very disarming gaze, and it's not at all who his audience might have expected a poet to be. And we want to remember that this is a moment when American writing is just barely beginning to come into its own. American writers feel that they are inferior to the great English tradition behind them. There is no real American voice in literature. And so as a result of that, American writers have to act very serious about themselves, even to a certain degree of pomposity, of putting on an image of importance. And here is somebody who looks like he's more likely to be going out to plow a field or drive a stagecoach or maybe work in the fire department than he is about to publish an important work of literature. Okay, so you have to read something like 20 pages into this book before you ever find the author's name, which is mentioned in passing, as it were, in one of the poems. Now, not only is this person who looks at us in this picture self-assured, but he turns out to be extraordinarily self-confident. Here he is addressing a gigantic beauty of a stallion. He says, "I but use you a minute, then I resign you, stallion. Why do I need your paces when I myself outgallop them?" So he's a very strong, very fast, very confident speaker. In one section where he's talking about the world as being made out of opposites, he looks at himself as made of opposites and particularly well suited to the purpose for which he's made. Sure as the most certain sure, plumb in the uprights, well entreated, braced in the beams, stout as a horse, affectionate, haughty, electrical. I am this mystery, here we stand. Okay? So imagine describing yourself as stout as a horse, affectionate, electrical, haughty. This poet wants to impress upon us his confidence, his worldly strength, and that he is, as he would put it, an American, one of the roughs. He's a working person, or at least he presents himself as such. I mean, in fact, he was a journalist and a carpenter school teacher, but he wants to be not a member necessarily of the educated classes of a kind of intellectual elite, but he wants to speak out of a community of American citizens, a democratic community. And he makes some very famous and grand assertions about himself. "Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems." Or the most famous of his claims, which is well, you'll see, "The scent of these armpits, aroma finer than prayer." Okay? Now, Whitman has such a little bit of sense of humor about this. I mean, he knows that he's making a jest when he says that, but he's also really embracing his own body. He's embracing the notion of loving our physicality, our daily presence in the world, our brash self-confidence, which he saw as an American trait. Right? Now, taken out of context, statements like that, "the scent of these armpits, aroma finer than prayer," sort of invite parody. They sound funny. They sound slapstick even. But miraculously, when you read them in context, they're not funny at all, or no more so than Whitman must have wished them to be. He's out to avoid an overly inflated tone. He wants a kind of colloquial American speech. Now, part of this process of developing a truly American literature is to try to embrace American language. This is 200 years after we have separated ourselves from the shores of Europe, and this is enough time for distinctly American vocabularies to appear, but these words are not necessarily appearing in our poetry. Whitman is out to import as much American talk as he can into the poem. For instance, he tells us he's not stuck up in one of his poems. Now, you will not find a 19th century English poem that uses the phrase stuck up, okay? But Whitman is very out to do that. He says in his 1855 edition, before he thought better of it, that he's not one of those foo-foos who wears cologne. If to die is different than anyone had supposed, he says, it is also luckier Now that's one of those Americanisms too, a word that probably makes no appearance in English poetry until Whitman consigns it to print. Luckier is no European word, nor a term suited to the refined hush of the Boston Athenaeum. Whitman's talk belongs to the Brooklyn streets, the ferries of Manhattan, and the farms of Long Island, which is why the poet and critic Ralph Waldo Emerson remarked famously that Whitman's book Leaves of Grass was a cross between the New York Herald and the Bhagavad Gita. Right? The New York Herald being an American newspaper full of daily American events, and the Bhagavad Gita being a sacred text of Hinduism with its pointing towards transcendence. Okay? So Whitman is making a kind of American Bible, which in some way brings very unlikely things together. Right? Whitman's language insists on a kind of pragmatic, earth-based knowledge. His transcendentalism happens in the here and now, in the realm of the daily. And it's spoken to us not only in the vernacular, in colloquial speech, but in a very direct, intimate way. This hour I tell things in confidence. I might not tell everybody, but I will tell you. Listen to that again. This hour I tell things in confidence. I might not tell everybody, but I will tell you. Who's you? You, the reader. You are reading these words in a book. And we know that a book is available to anybody who picks it up. There's nothing especially personal about that. You pick up any book lying around anywhere, and it's talking to the whole world at large. But Whitman says, this is a secret. I'm not going to tell just anybody this, but I'm going to tell you. And that makes his readers feel that he wants our attention in a very personal and particular way. These are not poems addressed to the world at large. They're not poems that are sort of spoken out into the ether. The great European poet of the 20th century, Paul Celan, said that writing a poem was like putting a message in a bottle and throwing it into the ocean. And you never could know who was going to find that bottle, who was going to read that poem, if anybody was. But Whitman does not believe that. Whitman thinks when he says, I will not tell anybody, but I'll tell you, that he can reach right through that page, right out to us, and commandeer our attention. The poet places his arm over the reader's shoulder and confidingly welcomes us in. But this is also one of Whitman's sly jokes. You, of course, are anyone at all, and the pronoun is unbounded by time and space. Whitman wishes to open the poem to anyone, anywhere, who may find it. Look in my face, he writes, while I snuff the sidle of evening. Now that's a great phrase, snuff the sidle of evening. He means sniff the air, twilight. Talk honestly, he says in parenthesis. Talk honestly. No one else hears you. And I stay only a minute longer. Okay? So the poet has said to us, I won't tell anybody, but I will tell you. And he says, talk to me honestly, for no one else hears you. So we're invited into a relationship of confiding and of intimacy that's a very unusual relationship to have to a total stranger. Right? Whitman wishes the widest possible form of public intimacy, a communion between his speaking body and that of you and you and you. We think of him as a poet of the first person because his great poem, his masterpiece, is called Song of Myself. He's continually saying, that poem begins, I celebrate myself. And whatever I shall assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. So he's always talking about I. But in fact, there was recently a computer study of all of Whitman's work, which did that tedious thing that computers can do and counted all the words. Right? And the most commonly used word in all of Walt Whitman's hundreds of pages of text is you. Again and again, you. Because he wants to draw us in. He wants us to be part of the project. What is outside the Song of Myself except you? It is you who must be invited in for the vision to be complete. You who must be won over or seduced. You who are not I and thus need to be absorbed into the poem's radical creation of a community. Because this is what Whitman wants to do. He does not wish to entertain you with his poems. He does not wish to educate you with his poems. We often think of art as a kind of amusement, that's going to maybe divert us. We go to the movies. We want to just be involved for a couple of hours. We don't necessarily think our lives are going to be changed. What Whitman wants to do is change the way you think, change the way you experience yourself, your separateness from other people, and your sense of being part of a community. This is why he says, every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Because he believes that we are truly not separate creatures, individual egos walking around inside a sack of skin who cannot really connect with each other, but that we are all part of a fabric of being, a continuous life. And that if we are truly awake to who we are, our self is not our limited little individual being, but the larger self of the collective whole. This is an idea that you see embodied in Asian philosophies, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, notions of the world which suggest that the individual self is something of an illusion, and that what we are really is a kind of spark of out of the whole fire. It's an idea that you can find articulated in contemporary physics, which says that the world is a continuous fabric of energy, and what you are is a moment in that field of energy, which is awake, noticing itself and noticing the people around you. Whitman believed that if we understood this, if we understood who we really are, it would change the world in which we live. Because if you and I are not really separate, then how come I could have more power than you do? Or I could have more money than you do? Or I could have more food than you do? If we really are equal beings, if we're all part of the same life, then we all deserve the same things, don't we? Then we are all in this common project of being together. And Whitman thought that we could forge a new American community based upon our affection for each other and our understanding that we are standing on this common ground. Okay. Now, there's not a lot of, I was going to say there's not a lot of American poetry, there's not a lot of literature that intends to mount an assault on how you understand yourself. But this is the friendliest, most good-natured attack on your sense of who you are that I can think of in the world of literature. So we're going to look at a poem together now that does exactly this. And you have it. This is section 6 of Song of Myself, which is the first poem in Whitman's book. He followed a strange practice. The first edition of his book is fairly slim, has so many poems in it. And what he did, instead of continuing to make other books, he just kept rewriting the first book, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And sometimes he made good choices in revising and adding to it, and sometimes he made poor choices, so that he put some weaker poems in that book, too, and didn't always serve as his own best editor or his own critic. So we're looking back to his very first edition, which is his wildest and, to my mind, his truest work. So I'm just going to read you this section. It's section 6 that begins, "A Child Said," and then we'll go through it and talk about it. Remember that this whole book, from which Song of Myself comes, is called Leaves of Grass. A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful, uncut hair of graves. Tenderly will I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And here you are the mother's laps. This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Oh, I perceive after all so many uttering tongues, and I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers, and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it, and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. All right, let's turn back to the beginning there. A few years ago, I was teaching a workshop some town away from home, and I wanted to use this poem, and I had forgotten my copy of Leaves of Grass, so I went in a secondhand bookstore, and I just pulled one off the shelf and bought it, and I didn't open it until I was ready to teach and discovered that it was covered with somebody's notes in the margins. I hate that when you have to have somebody else's notes in your book, right? And next to this question, a child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. This reader had written, "Isn't it grass?" Okay. And at first I thought, well, this is the difference between poets and not poets, you know, that the person who's not a poet would say, it's grass. That's all we need to say. And the poet would not be content with that word and need to keep exploring this idea and investigating it. You know, well, when a kid says, what is grass? What answer could you possibly have for that question? Hi. Well, I thought about it some more, and then I realized, the person who wrote that trusts words. The person believes, we name it, we say it's grass, that's it, we don't have to worry about it anymore. We've settled that. We know what it is. But the poet writing this poem actually does not trust that word. He says it's grass, and he doesn't feel he's said anything yet. He's got to keep going from there in order to try to figure out what do we mean by that? What is this ordinary, mysterious thing surrounding us? How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. Now, you can't tell from looking at it on this page, but there's a stanza break right there. There's a white space. So right after that, I do not know what it is any more than he, pause, silence, and then Whitman suggests an answer in the next stanza. Now, Walt Whitman worked for part of his life as a printer. He had probably 2 or 3 years of school his whole life. He went to bad public school in Brooklyn. And in the 19th century in Brooklyn, what you did in public school was you memorized things and you recited them. So that's all the education he ever had, formally. At the age of 11, he became a printer's apprentice, and he learned to set type, which in those days, you would take one letter made out of metal or wood, you would put it into a frame backwards, you know, screw it into the letters into the frame, ink it, and print the page. Right? So he set the first pages of this book himself. He went to a printer's office and he set the type. So he's very conscious of making pauses of where the line ends and where he's using white space. He's arranging this on the page for us visually. So that break has meaning. It means he's stopping to think. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. Pause. I guess, and hear how casual, that's that American diction again. I guess must be the flag of my disposition out of hopeful green stuff woven. So what's the grass? Well, it's me. It's an expression of my personality. It's the flag of my good nature, my hopefulness. But that doesn't seem like enough of an answer. Pause. Wait. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer, designedly dropped. Now, this is an old-fashioned mode of flirtation, okay? So a woman might take her perfumed handkerchief and deliberately drop it in front of some guy she wanted to flirt with so that he would pick it up and return it to her. And it has her initials on it. He might keep it and he could sniff her perfume and see her initials, and it would be this whole kind of love token. All right, so that is a pretty weird thing for God to do, right? To drop a handkerchief in order to flirt with you and have you ask, whose handkerchief is this? So we might have a clue there that Whitman is headed for some unusual theological territory, right, in saying this, so that we may see and remark and say, whose? So he's now said, I guess it's this, I guess it's that, pause, or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Think about how fast grass grows, right? There's always more, there's always more, there's always more. It's everywhere. He's still not satisfied. He has to keep generating these figures of speech to try to answer the child, because I think he still feels he hasn't got it right. He's got a clue about what grass is, but not enough, okay? Or, I guess, it is a uniform hieroglyphic, a letter, using the term for Egyptian letters, right? And it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white. Grass doesn't care about race. Grass doesn't care about privilege, or, how much money you have, or, what part of the world you live in. There it comes. It belongs to all these groups of people, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. And look how Whitman, now he slides into the grass's voice all of a sudden. I give them the same, I receive them the same. Now, I give them the same, that's obvious. The grass gives itself to us. It gives us a place to lie down. It gives us, its green, pleasant aspect. I receive them the same. In what way does the grass receive us? When you're buried, all right? So look what happens. Stanza break, white space, and you can see the poet thinking. He's gone from the grass saying, I receive you, to the next idea, and now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. And I think that's one of the most startling moments in American poetry. You notice it's one line all by itself. It's got white space on either side of it. Before he's been saying, I guess, now I guess is gone. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. All right, let's take the word beautiful out of that. And now it seems to me the uncut hair of graves. What happens? Darker, much darker, right? And you think about, I guess it's true, that the fact that the hair of the dead goes on growing after death. And so the uncut hair of graves sounds a little creepy, a little morbid. You throw the beautiful uncut hair of graves in there. And what do you see but long grass, right? The beautiful, lush grass sprouting out of the grave. So is that what grass is? Grass is the bodies of the dead, reconstituted. Out of the earth come the dead back again into life in some way. Now, if that's the case, look where that takes us. tenderly will I use you, curling grass, because now I understand what you are. You are the bodies of human beings. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And look at this strange little slide here, and here you are, the mother's laps. So children may, of course, this is the middle of the 19th century, and the infant mortality rate is absolutely enormous, much, much greater than it is today. This is why when you read the poems of Emily Dickinson, you think, why is this woman so death-haunted at such an early age? And you realize it's because she saw so many of her friends and her friends' children die before she even reached maturity. It was much more common to be closer to the fact of mortality in the middle of the 19th century before the invention of antibiotics or the discovery that washing your hands made infection less likely. Okay, so those children that are gone become the grass. They're taken from their mother's laps, but then the grass is the mother's lap. So those children are not out of their mother's laps anymore, right? They're there in the grass, which has become their mother. The grass is the baby and the mother both. There's a kind of reunion that's taken place. Now, Whitman notices that this grass is changing things. This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. What an image. The roof of the mouth, like the roof of a house, and the grass is coming from under the mouth out into the world. So the grass has changed things. It is not the color of the aging bodies or young bodies out of which it comes, but things have been transformed into this new material as they grow. Now, this might be the place where we might want to start to think about another meaning of the word grass. I told you Whitman was a printer, and printers used to, for practice, assemble, type, make up some words, nonsense, whatever, of their own, set it in type, and run it off to check how it looked. And the slang term for these pages of nonsense or whatever their own invented text was grass. Right? A printer made grass, and it meaning something disposable, something to, an experiment in words. So one thing that grass means then is language, is words itself. Now look what he says. Oh, I perceive after all so many uttering tongues, and I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. Now, this is getting complicated. The mouths of the dead are sprouting grass, and the dead have lost their original tongues, but they've got new tongues now, right? These little blades of grass, these little leaves. Now, Whitman calls his poem Leaves of Grass, and we don't usually talk about grass having leaves, right? What do we usually say? Blades, spears, right? To say leaves of grass, what does that suggest if we say leaves of grass? You do anything with that? They come from another source, okay? One thing we call the pages of a book are leaves, right? So when Whitman calls his book Leaves of Grass, he's talking about the individual page being a leaf, and that he's making grass in the way that the printer made grass. But they're also leaves of grass in the way that the grass comes up out of the bodies of the dead. The grass comes up and it seems to speak. Oh, I perceive after all so many uttering tongues. That whole field of grass is talking, and I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. They have something to say to us. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers, and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. Now, I told you before that Whitman is remarkable for his insistence on intimacy with his readers. So he's been saying to us, I wish I could translate this for you. I wish I could explain what I hear. But instead of making a statement, he now poses a question. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children. He wants us to stop and consider our own attitudes towards death, our own beliefs about disappearance, our own experience of the disappearance of those we love. What do you think? Pause, stanza break, and here comes Whitman's answer. They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. Now, if that line stopped there, the smallest sprout shows there's really no death, we might feel like arguing with Whitman. Well, yes, there is death. I mean, it's true that the grass comes back and the body, the matter of the body is recirculated, energy is recirculated. We know from, as 21st century readers, we know our Einstein that energy cannot disappear. It just simply keeps turning into another form, right? But Whitman is too cagey to say there really is no death and leave it at that. Look what he does. And if ever there was death, if in fact you believe there is such a thing, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it and ceased the moment life appeared. So think about that. We think that death is at the end of life and it's going to bring life to an end. But Whitman is saying that everything is in circulation, going down into the grass, coming back out again. Our bodies are in circulation, and language is in circulation. The words go down, the grass, the leaves are published, are spoken. The dead words go down into the earth, and the tongues speak them again and again and again. So we live in a world where instead of being separate selves, we will all be part of a vast community recycling project. Okay? Everything going down and coming up. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses. And to die is different from what anyone supposed. Now, this would be a very, very good poem if it stopped right there. But Whitman has one more trick up his sleeve. To die is different from what anyone supposed and luckier. And who would have thought to apply that adjective, that adverb, to our condition, right? To say that to die is lucky. What a perspective to hold. When you think about not to think about this in the abstract, but try to put it in really personal terms. I mean, imagine your own parents, right? Or somebody you love, or your dog, Can you actually say, your death is lucky? No, we can't do that, right? Because when we have that emotional attachment to another person, we can't stand at that distance. But Whitman wants us to try to think that maybe our individuality is not the thing that counts, but our joining ourselves to the larger common life. Okay. How much time do we have? If we're done, we have 5 minutes. Then that's the end. And if you and we have time here for a little talk. If you have questions or comments about any of that. And maybe I've so stunned you with my brilliance that you have nothing to say. Yes.
How do you find Walt Whitman interesting at first?
You read around in it, and what you want to do is the very best of his work is in the very first edition of Leaves of Grass, and it's published all by itself by Penguin Books. Has a photograph of him on the cover. It's a little skinny book, so it's not so big and daunting, threatening looking. You take that and don't feel you have to read it in order. Open it and just start reading whatever strikes you. Flip around, see what you like. There's no right way to read poetry, okay? So you take those poems, and Whitman said that he wanted people to read his poems outside. So you can do what he said. Go out somewhere under a tree. Go by yourself, or maybe go with a friend who you think might be into this project, and read each other some parts of it. And see what begins to strike you. So you have to it's like finding your way into it. But I guarantee you that if you find your way in, it will be a very powerful experience. That's a good question. Most of us, we don't grow up knowing how to read poetry. And we think that poetry is something old-fashioned, remote. It's a rarefied art like opera, that most of us might not enjoy so much. But we often feel that way because we don't have any experience of it, and often poetry is not well taught. Sometimes we can experience in school that a poem seems like it's a puzzle. It has hidden meanings in it, and our job as readers is to tease out the hidden meanings or to guess the knowledge that the teacher has that we don't have. And poetry doesn't want to be that. Poetry wants to be emotional, personal, intense. Its goal is to matter to you. So you have to warm up to it and teach yourself to read. And Whitman is a great text to do that with. Yeah.
How did you come to poetry?
I was confused, adolescent in turmoil. I mean, as who is not at 15 or 16, but I feel like I was especially so. And because I had always loved to read, what I started doing was keeping a little notebook in which I was just writing down. It wasn't a diary because that seemed boring to me, but I was writing down feelings and impressions and daydreams and quotations that I liked, and keeping this kind of notebook that was my very personal text. And in fact, I wrote it in horrible handwriting, so if anybody found it, they wouldn't be able to read it. So often I couldn't read it, And then I stumbled upon some poems that especially spoke to me. They were some poems by William Blake, these little dreamy songs. There were poems by Federico Garcia Lorca, the great Spanish modernist, whose poems are so full of color and feeling and a dreamy quality. And I was a Tolkien fan, and I loved the little songs that the characters sing in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And I thought, maybe I could take the material in my notebook and I could make something like that, like words that somehow said more than they said, that had a depth or a mystery about them that was somehow sort of beneath the surface of the language. So I started making some poems on my own, and then I was lucky because I had a high school drama teacher who gave us an assignment, which was to perform something we had written. And I memorized a couple of my poems, and I performed them, and the teacher said, well, that's great, but it's supposed to be something you wrote. I said, well, I did, and she didn't believe me. I mean, it's not that they were great poems by any means, but they were sort of, not too many of my peers were reading Blake and Garcia Lorca. They were sort of precocious with language anyway. And so to catch me as a plagiarist, she showed some of my poems to a poet who lived in my community. This was in Tucson, Arizona, in the late 60s, early 70s. And this poet took an interest in me. He wanted to know, who was this kid? And he invited me to come down to the university and meet with him and to come to the Poetry Center where, events like this were held. And so I started listening to writers and started reading more contemporary poetry. And it just felt like being able to join a community of artists in a very welcoming way. Yeah, I never stopped. Okay, well, thank you all for coming.